The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Welcome back to our next video as we go through the Gospel of Luke. In this video, we will take up where we left off with Jesus casting out the demon from the demon-possessed man, and we'll conclude Luke chapter 8. As we were thinking last video that Jesus was casting this demon out, we noticed that in verse 28, chapter 8, that the demon recognized Jesus and he was greatly afraid of him. And we pointed out that the demon believed in the power of Jesus. And that goes right along with what James tells us in James chapter 2, verse 19. Even the demons believe and tremble. The demons lived in fear and dread of their ultimate faith, which was to be cast into the lake of everlasting fire. And we noticed in Revelation chapter 20, verse 10, that it tells us that the devil who deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. This would be at the judgment day, when God renders his final judgment on Satan and his demons. And then we noticed in verse 29 that it only took the command or the words or the voice of Jesus to cause these legions of demons to come out of this man. The power of God's word, the power of Jesus' word is so great that it overpowered whatever power these demons had, and they seem to have quite a bit of power as it relates to this man as they possessed him in a very aggressive and full way. The demons had given this man great power, but it was nothing compared to the power of the Word of God. And we noticed in verse 31, as we were concluding our previous video, that the demons begged Jesus. They begged. This was not a negotiation. They knew full well that his power far exceeded theirs, and their destiny was in his hands. They begged him not to be sent to the abyss, and it showed their ultimate power that they had. And as we were concluding our discussion in our previous video, we looked at the concept of the abyss. And I'd like to go to Revelation chapter 20 and read verses 1, 2, and 3, which give us a little insight into this. It says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the keys to the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him up for 1,000 years, and he cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, so that he should not deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years were finished. But after these things he must be released for a while." Here we see the power of God as this angel comes down and lays hold on Satan, or lays hold upon the devil, and binds him up for a period of 1,000 years, or at least a period of a significant amount of time. And he casts him into this bottomless pit, or this abyss. And these verses show the ultimate power that God and his angelic hosts have over Satan and over his demons. In verse 32 now, back to Luke chapter 8, I'm going to begin reading in verse 32 down through verse 39. "Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain, as they begged him that he would permit them to enter them, and he permitted them." These are the demons that are begging Jesus, "Don't send us to the abyss. Send us at least to this herd of swine." And Jesus allowed it. Verse 33. "Then the demons went out of the man and entered into the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. When those who fed them saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and the country. Then they went out to see what had happened, and came to Jesus, and found the man from whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed in his right mind, and they were afraid. And they also had seen it told them by what means he had been demon-possessed was healed. Then the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear, and he got into the boat and returned. Now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him, but Jesus said unto him, sent him away, saying, Return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you. And he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. We see here the ultimate defeat and submissive condition of the demons to Jesus. And that was never more important than them begging and being allowed to enter into a herd of swine. Not even that could they do without the Lord's permission. They were totally submissive. They were totally subjected. They were totally under the power of the Lord at this time. Now, why did Jesus allow these demons to go into the herd of swine? Well, we're left to wonder maybe just a little bit. However, it is a vivid display of the true purposes of Satan and his demons, and that is to destroy whatever they can. In John chapter 13, when Jesus was getting ready to be betrayed, it says that Satan entered into Judas, took possession of him to the extent that he directed what Judas would do. When a society or a man or any of us allow Satan to rule us or to rule the society, the decline and destruction is certain, and it's fatal, and it's often swift. It was the demons, we must remember, not Christ, that destroyed the herd, just as they were destroying the life of the man they had inhibited. Sometimes people will wonder, how could Christ destroy this herd of swine? I don't believe he did destroy the swine. I believe it was the demons who did it. Now, God or Jesus did allow it to happen, but the demons caused it to happen. And there's a lot of difference between allowing something and causing it. You remember in the book of Job, God allowed Satan to do various things to Job, but it was Satan who did them, who made that choice and caused it. God allows us to make choices, and sometimes the choices you and I are allowed to make are not good, but God doesn't cause those choices. We choose them. We do that of our own free will. In verse 35, then, we see a totally changed man. Remember, he was naked, he was bound, he was out of his mind. In verse 35, it says, when they came out to see what had happened and came to Jesus, they found this man from whom the demons had departed, doing what? He was sitting at the feet of Jesus in a worshipful posture. He was clothed, and he was in his right mind. That was a transformation. The removal of Satan and his demons from this man and the inclusion of Jesus into this man's life was a totally transformational thing for this man. And it's something that is very, very impressive, and in a spiritual sense, it's something that we can and have, and maybe in each of us, seen occur, a great change when Jesus came into our life. And we notice in verse 37 that the whole multitude surrounding the region asked him to depart. That's curious. Why would you ask someone with that kind of power to help somebody to depart? Well, it was probably beyond their ability to grasp, or at least their willingness to grasp. But I wonder, too, if they weren't thinking of the loss of that herd of swine. Maybe they put more value in their material resources than they did in their spiritual resources. Maybe they valued having things of material value more than they valued having things of spiritual value. Certainly that would be of human nature, and certainly we see that occurring today. People who put their material, their jobs, their monies, their bank accounts ahead of their spiritual souls and its salvation. And we also see in verse 38 that Jesus, even though this man wanted to go with him, left him as a witness to declare what Christ had done. By doing that, Jesus set up a position where his gospel, his power, and his ability over evil was proclaimed by this man in the city, even after Jesus had left. Now we move on to the final section of this 8th chapter, verses 40 through 56. And really this group of verses contains two stories, two sections. The first is the restoring of Jairus' daughter. This is seen in verses 40 through 42, and then later in 49 through 56. But interspersed between that, we have the healing of a woman with an issue of blood in verses 43 through 48. So rather than break up the story of Jairus' daughter, I'm going to deal with the woman's issue of blood in verses 43 through 48 first, and then we'll go back and pick up the restoration of life to this young daughter of Jairus. So let me read now verses 43 through 48. Luke chapter 8. Now a woman having a flow of blood for 12 years, who had spent all her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any, came from behind and touched the border of his garment, Christ's garment, and immediately her flow of blood stopped. And Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter and those with him said, "Master, the multitudes throng and press you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus said, "Somebody touched me, for I perceived power going out from me." Now when the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him, and declared to him in the presence of all the people the reason she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. And he said to her, "Daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." This is a story of a woman who apparently was trying to get to Jesus, but in the throng of the crowd, many people were touching him as he was jostled undoubtedly by people pressing upon him. But he immediately recognized that something special had happened and that somebody had touched him. We're told in verse 43 that this woman had spent much on her attempts to be healed. Mark seems to indicate that some of this might have been just foolish medicine, but Luke doesn't take that particular approach. It's just the fact that she had tried and spent a lot, if not most of her resources on trying to be healed, and it simply was not a healable illness, at least for the medicine of that time. And then she touched the hem of his garment, we see in verse 44. Notice that she was then immediately healed. She touched the border of his garment, and immediately the flow of blood stopped. This was not a gradual thing. You and I have undoubtedly been healed from various things in our lives, but we would take antibiotics or maybe some surgery or whatever the doctors would prescribe, and it would take a period of time, and we would then hopefully be healed. But when Jesus healed people, there was no time lapse. It was an immediate thing. The healing of the body was immediate. So this was not simply something that others hadn't been able to do. This was something that Jesus could do immediately. And that's a characteristic of the miraculous healings we find in Scripture. Jesus then, in verse 45, asks a very interesting question, at least to me. He said, "Who touched me?" Now, why would he ask that? Jesus is omniscient. God is omniscient. Don't you think Jesus knew? Was he asking because he didn't know who touched him? We're told that he had such mental omniscient capacities that he was able to read the thoughts of people. For instance, in Luke chapter 6 and verse 8, well, verses 7 and 8 specifically, it says, "So the scribes and Pharisees watched him closely, whether he would heal on the Sabbath, that they might find an accusation against him. But he knew their thoughts." Notice that. He knew their thoughts. He could read their minds, and said to the man who had the withered hand, "Arise and stand here," and he arose and stood. Now that's an interesting story, but the point I wanted to make out of that is Jesus knew their thoughts. If Jesus could know their thoughts, then certainly you would think he would have known who touched him. Jesus knew not only that, but also who touched him. You know, there are times in the Bible where God asks questions when we know full well that God already knew the answer to it. For instance, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 9, he goes seeking Adam and Eve after they had sinned, and he said, "Adam, where are you?" Don't you think the Lord knew exactly where Adam was? Now, that was a rhetorical question, I guess. The next chapter, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 9, when he comes to Cain, who had killed Abel, he says, "Where is Abel your brother?" I think God knew exactly where Abel was. But he was asking the question maybe out of a point of emphasis, or to get the people to come to grips with it. But God knows. But the question that Jesus asked, or maybe the reason for the question that Jesus asked us, I believe had a purpose. This was not to be a stealth healing. It could have been, but she was saved by her faith and healed. And the crowd needed to see that. The crowd needed to see, number one, that she was healed, and number two, that Jesus was able to tell her that her healing came because of her faith. It was a visible proof of his healing to the crowd. You know, when Jesus healed, it wasn't necessarily to take all illness away from the world. If that had been the purpose, he would have healed everybody. No, it was the purpose of a sign to show people his power and what faith in him could bring about. Before we leave this passage, I'd like to look at verse 48, where Jesus says to her, "Daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." The word well there is from the Greek word sozo, S-O-Z-O, and it means to save, to deliver, to protect. It can include, yes, physically being delivered, and she was delivered from her illness, but it also can mean, and I think does mean, spiritually she was healed, implying also rescue from not only her physical ailment, but from her spiritual ailment. And we find this same word used in Matthew chapter 1, where we are told that Jesus shall save his people. There he's obviously talking about it in a spiritual sense. A little later in the next chapter here in Luke chapter 9, verse 56, Jesus came to save man. Another spiritual application, and it's this same word, sozo. In Luke chapter 19, verse 9, "For the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which is lost." And we understand that to be that he was seeking and to save mankind spiritually. All the same use of this word. So I think it's quite probable that this woman was not only healed physically, but she was healed spiritually. It indicates that forgiveness of sin was also extended by the Lord to this woman because of her great faith. But we need to understand that faith is an action, not simply a state. And this woman did that. Her faith acted, brought her to Christ. It's when our faith is active and brings us to Christ, brings us to good works. When we come to him in obedience, that's the faith that saves us and brings us to salvation. Now I'd like to go back to verse 40 and look at this story of Jairus and his daughter who had died. So let me read verses 40 through 42 as we begin to look at that in Luke chapter 8. "So it was when Jesus returned that the multitude welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. Here we're told that this was Jairus' only daughter. The word that's actually used there could certainly imply that may well have been his only child, which would have made it even more difficult for Jairus to handle. But either way, to lose a child, and I know some of you undoubtedly have, that's something that no one can fully grasp until it has occurred to them. So we have this ruler of the synagogue, a man who was honored and respected within the community. He was probably somewhat of an overseer or a manager of the synagogue. We have similar references to this kind of a role found in the book of Acts. For instance, in Acts chapter 13, verse 15, it reads, "And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to him, saying, 'Men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on.'" Seeming to imply that the rulers of the synagogue seemed to oversee the program, or to kind of outline the events that would take place in the synagogue. Later in Acts chapter 18, verse 8, we have another reference similar to that. "Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized." Crispus here was a ruler of the synagogue, and he became a convert. He came to the Lord and became a disciple of his. And the fact that Jairus here fell down at the feet and begged him could show how desperately his heart was broken, how desperately he was doing whatever he could do to have his daughter be restored, this little 12-year-old girl. We see in verse 42 that I read for you that she was dying. In some of the other accounts, she was rendered as dead. And we're going to see as we get down then to verse 49 that in fact she had died maybe when Jairus was coming to the Lord, but she was dead at the point when Jairus did speak to the Lord. So let me read now for you verse 49 through the end of the chapter, verse 56. "While he was still speaking," this would be the Lord, "someone came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, 'Your daughter is dead. Don't trouble the teacher.' But when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, 'Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well.' When he came into the house, he permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and mother of the girl. Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, 'Do not weep, she's not dead, but sleeping.' And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called her, saying, 'Little girl, arise.' And when her spirit returned, and she arose immediately, and he commanded that she be given something to eat, and her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened." So now we find Jesus coming to the house of Jairus and eventually being able to bring this young girl back to death. But back in verse 49, we have the messengers coming to Jairus and saying, "She's dead. It's too late." It's as if she's saying, there's no use bothering Jesus. She's already dead. They must have thought he could heal her, but maybe not bring her back from the dead. It's a little bit like what we find in John chapter 11 when Lazarus died and Mary says to Jesus, "If you had just been here, I know you could have restored him." But Lazarus was already dead. But Jesus said, "You don't need to be fearful. You don't need to worry." And he says that in verse 50, "Do not be afraid, only believe, and she shall be made well." Only believe. We need to keep our handle on that and understand what it is really implying. Jairus could either believe in Jesus and trust in his power to raise the dead, or he could go home and bury his dead little girl. That was really the choice that Jairus had. If you want to go home and bury her, that's your choice. But if you will believe in me, then all will be well. Believing was really his only alternative for his daughter. His peers told him to give up on Jesus and go bury his daughter. But this wasn't what Jairus was to do. It's a little bit like, again, in the account of Job. Remember in Job chapter 2, his wife comes and says, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? Give up on God, and you might as well die. There's just no hope. Well, that's what Jairus' peers seemed to be exhorting him to do, but it wasn't what was in Jairus' heart. Now, Jesus here tells him in verse 50, down a little bit later, that they should not fear. Do not be afraid, it says, only believe. What was there that Jairus might be afraid of? Well, he could have had fear for his daughter's life, fear that she was gone and she wasn't going to come back, he wasn't going to see her again. He could have been fearful of the scorn that his peers were putting on him to think that now Jesus could still help him even though she was dead. Or it could be Jesus was saying, don't fear that God's purposes were thwarted by the delay of the healing of this woman with the issue of blood. Jairus could have thought, well, if you hadn't healed this woman with the issue of blood in verses 43 through 48, you might have got to my daughter before she died. And Jesus could be saying, don't be fearful of that delay. You remember back in John 11 when Jesus was called to Lazarus, he delayed going for whatever reason that was best in his mind. But that delay did not cause Lazarus from being resurrected again. And the delay here was not going to cause Jairus' daughter to not be resurrected again. Just kind of an interesting side here in verse 51, as we're here, we have the mention of Peter, James, and John, kind of the three dominant apostles that were often with Jesus. They were with him at the Transfiguration. This is the first mention by Luke in his gospel of this inner group that did become quite pivotal in some of the accounts and some of the lessons and teachings of Jesus. We also have, as we go down into verse 52, Jesus saying to him, do not weep, she is not dead, but sleeping. Now they knew she was dead. Everyone had apparently, the messengers had told him that she was dead. But what we have here, I believe, when Jesus says she's not dead but sleeps, is an interesting use that we often find in Scripture of God's view of death. And he often calls it sleep. It's a common word for death in God's vocabulary, and I think there's a good reason for that. A couple of examples. In John chapter 11, verse 11, back to the story of Lazarus again, it says, these things he said, and after that he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Now we know Lazarus is dead. We're told that his body had begun to decay and was stinking. But Jesus refers to it as sleep, and he's going to go wake him up. Similarly, in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 4, we find Peter writing, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. Now these fathers, these forefathers, these men of the Old Testament, they had died, but yet here it's referred to as falling asleep. And of course, maybe the most classic New Testament passage on this is found in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 15, where Paul is talking to the Thessalonians about the return of Christ. And it says in verse 15, God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. And there he's not talking about people who just nodded off. He's talking that God will bring with him those who have died as disciples of Christ. God uses the term sleep often to describe death. And I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. It's the different way God views death than we do. God doesn't view death as anything more permanent, physical death, as anything more permanent than maybe the nap you and I might take on a Sunday afternoon or whenever we have a moment of an evening. We expect that we might go to sleep, but we're going to wake up. God views death as something that's going to occur, but we're going to wake up. We're going to be resurrected. All are going to be resurrected, some unto life and some unto death, some unto heaven and some unto eternal damnation. But death, physical death, is not going to last. We are going to be resurrected. We are going to come back, and our souls and spirits will be joined with our resurrected spiritual bodies. Those of us who are children of God will have that glorious moment when we will ascend into the clouds to be with Him forevermore in our physical totality, body, soul, and spirit, even though our body would now be a spiritual body and not a physical body. Others who have not been His disciples will still be resurrected. We find that in John chapter 5, verses 29. They'll still be resurrected, but they will then be cast into the lake of fire, cast into hell. But it's very comforting. And Paul uses that term in 1 Thessalonians, chapter 4. When he gets to verse 18, he says, you don't need to sorrow as those that have no hope, because death does not have the final say. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 55 and 56 talks about death isn't going to hold us. The grave isn't going to hold us. We're going to be brought back to life. And as children of God, we're brought back to a life that far exceeds anything that we have ever experienced in terms of goodness, holiness, and comfort. In verse 54, we find an indication here that this little girl certainly was dead, and the Holy Scriptures are indicating to it. It said, he took her by the hand and called, saying, little girl, arise. And then in verse 55, then her spirit returned. This indicates that she was dead. Her spirit had left. That's the definition of physical death, when our soul and spirit leave our body. And for her to come back to life, her spirit had to return. She was not simply asleep in a physical sense. She was not in a coma. She was not in a trance. Her spirit had departed, and she actually certainly was dead. Then in verse 56, Jesus makes an interesting comment that's a little bit hard for us to necessarily grasp. It says in verse 56, her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no man what had happened. Why would Jesus tell them, don't tell anybody what happened? At other times he did that, but at other times he said, you go and tell what things had happened to the demon-possessed man. He told him to go to the city and tell what great things had been done to him. But now we have Pharisees that were present here, and they were pressing hard on Jesus. And Jesus, I think, didn't want to prematurely press hard on that. You remember after raising Lazarus, they set about to kill him. His time was not yet. So it may well be that the phrase, tell no man, was an indication that Jesus was saying, it's not yet my time to die. So you don't need to go tell a lot of people, because I have work to do before the crucifixion. It's an interesting statement, and we can't maybe know absolutely for sure, but I think that's a very plausible and logical and entertaining and comforting way to look at it. So now, as we've gone through this 8th chapter of Luke, we've seen the calming of the seas, Jesus displaying his power over nature in verses 22 through 35. We've seen his power over the demons and Satan by the casting out of demons from this man in verses 26 through 39. We saw the power he has over illness in healing this woman with an issue of blood in verses 43 through 48. And now we conclude with him showing his power over life and death by the raising again from the dead of this daughter of Jairus. The power of Jesus on great display here in Luke chapter 8. On great display throughout the entire Gospels. But I think the latter part of this chapter is such a concise display of the power of God. And we need to remember that God's power then is no greater than his power is today. The same God that did all of these things can do many wonders in our lives, in our hearts. Maybe he won't bring us back from the dead. Most people he didn't. Maybe he won't heal all of our illnesses immediately, but his power is there to save our souls. And that's far more important than any physical illness, physical death, or physical trauma we might endure. I think when those things come, being able to go to the Lord in prayer is a very comforting thing. But I don't always know what's best to pray for. I don't always know whether it's best to ask the Lord to heal me or not. Maybe my time is up and he understands it would be better. I tend to pray that whatever comes my way, let me handle it, let me accept it in a way that will glorify his name. If my life continues and I can glorify the Lord in my life, so be it. If my death will glorify the Lord, then so be it. We simply have to have the mindset to accept what God in his wisdom knows is best for us, and for us to take what comes from him with thankfulness and with appreciation, and to use it in a way that glorifies his name. This concludes our discussion on Luke chapter 8. Thank you for being with us, and may the Lord be with you until we're able then to later go into videos that go into Luke chapter 9 and into the rest of the book. May the Lord bless you, may the Lord keep you, and may the Lord be with you and us with him all the days of our lives.